I have always been an avid creepy story reader. It started when I was about 14 years old, now 27, with Snopes.com, a popular urban legend story website. I have books upon books of urban legends, ghost stories, and campfire stories weighing down my bookshelf. To say that I am a collector of morbid curiosities is a bit of an understatement. I have shelves lined with tokens of the strange. I grew up in a relatively small town in the South. The crime rate was decently low. About an hour and a half away, there was a large city that has one of the worst crime rates in the South. Over time, the trash from the big city started filtering into our little town. As a result, the once great town that I lived in got more and more crime-ridden. This particular incident happened a few years ago, and I don't talk about it with many. At the time, I worked in a semi-decent hotel that was bought out by some foreigners. I will not get into the race or culture of the foreigners, as I do not wish to spark a debate over them. Needless to say, they were the type that were out just to run it into the ground and get every little penny that they could out of it. They changed the name of the hotel to one with lesser fees, still a franchise, but a much, much lesser of one. We went from hotel to motel over a month period. As a result, we started getting less than desirable guests at the once decent hotel. Drug addicts, prostitutes, pimps, people just out of jail, pedophiles, those running from the law. I could go on and on. I had my life threatened probably at least once per week, mostly from guests whom my then foreign boss thought should be kicked out without a refund. It was here that the scariest and most traumatic event, thus far, of my life was to occur. I'll start at the beginning. I went into my usual shift, 3 p.m. through 11 p.m., on a Monday afternoon. Nothing was out of the ordinary. In fact, we were relatively slow, so I was able to read almost the entire night. For those of you in the hotel industry, you know how very much we treasure the slow nights. I didn't have any creepy encounters this particular night. No weirdos, no weird sounds, etc. All was absolute quiet, it seemed. The next 2 days I had off, so I enjoyed my days like usual. Any day away from that place is like a day in heaven. The next day I had to work was a Thursday. I do my usual routine of going and getting snacks and drinks before I go into work. Since I have to work an 8-hour shift with literally no breaks, it's important to have a small amount of food to shove in my mouth in the breaks of people coming in. The moment I went into the motel, I smelled a horrible smell. It smelled almost like a mix of old wet carpet and poop. I can't really describe it any other way, because I had never smelled this particular scent before. I found the manager in the laundry room immediately, helping his wife with the dirty laundry of the day, and reported the smell to him. I tell him the hallway smells like shit. Those were my exact words. He looks at me funny, says he doesn't smell anything weird, and proceeds to walk down the hallway spraying Febreze all over every inch of the carpet he can find. I still remember him to this day, flapping his arms to spread the smell of Febreze and saying, "Smell fresh? Smell fresh?" I had to admit that the odor was somewhat masked and went about my usual shift. That night, I got a call from a room on the first floor with a complaint that the carpet was soaking wet, possibly a busted pipe. This made sense to me, as the pungent odor I had smelled earlier was, as I stated earlier, reminiscent of that old wet and mildewy carpet. I knocked on the door, and I was led into the room by a woman who I would say was in her late 40s. I noticed a guy was in a room as well, tall, muscular, and nasty looking, with bushy black hair pulled into a ponytail and a scruffy beard. He looked to be on drugs, and was pacing back and forth in front of the window avidly looking into the parking lot. I ignored him as best I could, seeing as how I dealt with drugged out freaks like this all the time. I went towards the bathroom, and sure enough, the carpet right before the bathroom was damp. I also smelled that odor again, more pungent than ever. I offered to move the odd couple, saying that maintenance wasn't here and I couldn't fix it by myself, only being the front desk clerk. I didn't have the skills. They adamantly refused to leave the room, so I just brought them some extra towels to put down on the floor to soak up the water. They seemed content with this idea, and I pushed the incident out of my mind. I left at 11 p.m. that night, as usual. The next day, I had decided that I wanted something good to eat before going into work. I passed the motel on my way to the restaurant and noticed that police cars were outside of it. Typical Friday night, I thought to myself, and laughed it off. I texted my partner and let him know that I had seen police cars outside of the building as I passed on my way to the restaurant. I was waiting in line to get my food when I received a text back saying that I should read an article that had been posted that day, and not to freak out too bad. I rolled my eyes, as I knew that if it was in the news, I would have other people asking me about it all day long. Glancing at the article, it was titled, "Body Found Under Bed at Local Hotel." I freaked out. Suddenly the smell from yesterday made a lot more sense. The thought of me having smelling and breathing in decaying corpse the night before was almost too much for me to handle. Out of pure curiosity, and against my better judgment, I did go into work that day. As soon as I stepped out of my car, I had a few people approach me and ask if I had heard what had happened. I merely shook my head and headed towards the building. The manager met me in the entrance of the lobby and ushered me in through the door. I could smell the now identified scent tenfold, and all I could manage to ask was, "Is it true?" "Is what true?" he asked. "Did they find a body under one of the beds?" I replied, shocked that he didn't automatically know what I was talking about. "Oh, that. Yes, that's true." What the fuck? Seriously? That is the best thing you could think to come up with as a reply? That whole day the scent was heavy. I took to walking around with a bottle of air freshener held under my nose. The police department was with us for 2 days after that, reviewing the tapes, so I felt extremely safe knowing that I was protected. I later found out the rest through the media and by talking to the officers. It turned out that they had almost immediately identified the corpse under the bed as a lady that had been bad into meth. Her abusive boyfriend had been staying with her that night and was also doing meth. They caught the guy, 2 days later, wielding a knife and running through a neighborhood. He was apparently homeless, and he had all kinds of drug paraphernalia and meth on his person at the time of arrest. Curiosity took over. I searched for him on our prison website and found him. I let out a faint screech as I realized that the man in the picture, the man that they had caught, was the same man pacing back and forth in the room that had complained of the wet carpet the night before. The room that the lady and the man had had together was the room right next to the one that the body had been found in. To know that I had been in such close proximity to an urban legend-style murderer really intrigued me and freaked me out. Through social media, I found the victim and read accounts of her character, and my heart went out to the family. Even though she was a druggie, no one deserves to die and be disposed of like this. It turns out that while high on meth, the guy would choke the now victim out until she would black out. He would then tase her with a little handheld taser until she came back around. Only this time, she didn't come back around. Scared, he put her body in the wooden encasement under the bed and fled. The next day, he returned with another lady to stay in the room right next door. Whether or not the other lady knew about what he had done is still a mystery. An elderly couple checked into the room, with the body under the bed, the next day, and stayed for a few days, not realizing the smell. At first, the police went after them. I mean, how can you stay in a room that long and not notice that smell? I bet they were actually really shocked to find out that they had slept on top of a corpse for the past few nights. It turned out that the couple was innocent, of course, and then they were able to go back and realize that it had been the previous guest before them. Can you imagine the police pulling you over and asking you these questions? I believe that I'd be violently sick. I won't go into the gory details of them finding her under the bed, or how they removed her, as I'm not sure that I legally have the right to discuss such issues. I will say, however, that they stripped the room bare and the hallways continued to stink for months afterwards. I continued to work there for a little over a year. I was planning my escape from the place, but needed to save up money to get the hell out of town. One further mention that I will make, that is actually quite humorous to me now, is that, as I said, I have a bit of a morbid curiosity and do believe in ghosts. One night, when it was dark and there were no more guests coming in, my curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the now concrete block of a room and let myself in. I called out what I came to know was the woman's name who died and had been unceremoniously shoved under the bed. I said, "Are you here?" All of a sudden, I hear a loud barking noise coming from the room next to it, and I about messed myself as I hurriedly ran out of the room. I hadn't realized that the people staying next door to that room had a dog, and it had heard me talking. I went back only once after that. I opened the door to the room, peered inside, and said quickly, "They caught the man. If you're in here, you can rest in peace. He's in jail," before slamming the door shut and never going back in there. While some of the stuff in my creepy encounter was omitted, I testify that the rest of it is all true, and backed by numerous articles on said event. As I said before, I will not disclose my name or the name of the motel in question. I don't want to harm their reputation any more than it already has been. I will never forget that man's face, or the scent of decay. Both are burned into my mind to this day. Just remember, pay attention to your surroundings, and when checking into a hotel, check those beds. I was about 8 or 10 years old, and I had a friend who I would play with. She lived next door to me. My friend and I lived in an apartment upstairs, and from this apartment you could look directly out the back door to see a long street that my grandmother lived on. Our apartment was on the main street, so basically everyone can see everything we did. Next door is this guy named Joe. I never knew of him or his backstory, but my mom and everyone who grew up around him knew his story very well. My friend and I were looking for somewhere to have our own hangout. You know all kids like their own clubhouses. We were playing alongside Joe's shed. There's a sidewalk between his shed and the house. There's no fence, so you aren't hidden, but there is a low cement wall. You can see directly over it into his yard, and you can see the shed clear as day. We were saying that his shed would be perfect for our hangout, but we weren't able to ask him since we didn't know him that well. Joe just happened to be outside in his garden when he heard us talking about his shed. We were sitting against the other side of the cement wall when he said, "Sure, go on, but you have to clean it out first. If you do, you can use it." Now mind you, where I live nothing really creepy goes on. No kidnappings, rapes, or anything like that, so we really had nothing to worry about. We lived directly next door, and my grandma lived right there too, so we accepted. But my friend was a bit nervous since she had no clue who he was. She wasn't raised in the same spot I was. My mom knew of him, but I didn't. She never told me much about him either, so I trusted him because I figured I was safe so long as she actually knew the person, even though they were never even friends and she never talked to the man. I was that damn dumb. And basically everyone in my neighborhood knew each other. Fast forward a few days. We were finally deciding to clean out the shed. There were about 10 huge bags of cement, buckets that were dry coated with cement, shovels covered in dry cement, and dirty rags everywhere. I asked Joe where he wanted it, and he just said to set it down somewhere in the yard. He then asked us if we wanted a soda. I, of course, said sure, but my friend was kind of freaked out. He invited us in, and she took off running to the house, saying that she was going to tell her mom. I just stood there like, well, okay, more soda for me. So I go to head inside, and I remember this clear as if it happened yesterday. When I went up to the doorway, the entire room was an orange color, kinda 70s looking. There were guns hanging on the wall, laying on the ground, on the couch, on the table, and one on top of the TV, and huge dumbbells laying on the ground too, blocking the doorway. As I went to walk inside the house, I felt as though something was pushing me, not letting me go in that house. Maybe I was scared. Maybe I heard a little voice in the back of my head saying, "Don't do it, just leave now." Or some guardian angel. I tried for a minute or so to get in, before I took off running in fear. That was the last time I talked to the man. I'm 19 years old now, and I'm living with my grandma and my mom in the same place. His house right in front of us. If you look out the middle room window, you can see his house clearly. Joe was in prison, but his daughter lived there with her husband/boyfriend and had 2 boys. It was morning, and I woke up earlier than everyone else, about 6 or 7 a.m. I looked out the middle room window and saw 2 black coroner vans in front of his house. I was freaked out. Even the police and SWAT team were at his house. I woke up my mom shouting, "The coroner's at Joe's house." So we were all awake at this point. We stood there and waited for hours. News crews came, more police, SWAT team, ambulances, etc. Finally, we were told that he had murdered a woman who testified against him in court. He had tortured that woman until she died. Here's the scary part that makes me realize why I was so scared to enter his house. She was being tortured, or was already killed, the day he invited us into his house. It's as if there was a barrier holding me back, protecting me. I was on the news along with my mom and a few others. He had asked his family to dig the body up from inside his house. Over the time he was there, he had taken out the hardwood floor and filled it with cement and acted as though he was remodeling the house. We saw the body being taken out, and they couldn't even lift it because she was covered in cement. It was so damn scary. She had been buried there for nearly 11 years. I found out sometime later that he was a drug addict, as was the woman he murdered, and he had been crazy all his life. He had shot up a tunnel in front of his house screaming something about people coming to get him, and other crazy stuff that my mom and the neighbors know about, and I don't want to know about. Let's just say, I see my town a lot differently since that happened. I never was too trusting of people after that. I grew up on the countryside, right next to a national park frequently visited by nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. It was the kind of park where you're not really allowed to bike or ride horses, only walk or run. But 10-year-old me felt like it was a stupid rule, and did so anyway, because the trails were perfect for it. I knew fully well that I wasn't supposed to do that, and was caught a few times, but nothing much came of it apart from the half-hearted, "Don't do it again." And I did, of course. Until one day something frightening happened that made me stop. My family were horse breeders, and I would often take one of the horses for a ride, usually in the Forbidden Park. This day, very early in the morning, the first day of the summer holiday, it was beautiful outdoors. Misty and foggy, yet a sky that promised a sunny day ahead. Since it was so early, before 6 o'clock, I knew there would be no one on the trail to see me, so I let the horse set off full speed along the trail. I only slowed down on one part of the trail that got steep on one side, leading down to the river, because the thought of one step too close to the edge was too much even for a kid with next to non-existing risk assessment skills. Suddenly, the horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. I grew up with horses all my life, and knew that usually indicates that you need to investigate. Is there something wrong with the hoofs? Did the horse spot something that spooked it? The hoofs were fine, but the horse didn't move an inch. That's when I saw it. Someone had set up a trap, a thin, sharp metal wire across the trail, at perfect neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around, but didn't see anyone. The wire was well attached to 2 trees and impossible for me to remove, so I led the horse around it. And to do so, I had to walk a bit up into the wooded area on the side of the trail. That is when I heard the singing. There is a song called Hej Tom Tukabar, and it was that melody, but the lyrics were different and sung in a muffled, sniggering voice. Today, I only remember parts of it, but translated it would have been something like, "Hey, all you runners, come here passing, let the lifeblood pour out." I, as silently as I could, and with my heart in my throat, backed away, got up on the horse, and hurried back as fast as I could. I knew that I had to tell someone about it, but at the same time I wanted to avoid admitting to riding a huge and very forbidden horse on those protected trails. So now I had a problem. The old stories about a mad old man living in the shed in the woods, a shed that was once a cottage for a local hunter, came back to me as I hung on to the horse for dear life. I got home and told my brother what had happened, and he went back there with me in tow. We found the wire trap, and after a while of searching, we also found a spear-like pole in the ground, right on the spot where you'd land if you came running and jumped over the fallen tree on the trail. That's when we called the police. The area was searched, and several similar traps were found, but no sight of the old man. The following summer, though, there was big news in the local paper about spear-like poles being found right under the water's surface, directly under the little tower you're supposed to dive from at the lake. And black garbage bags filled with black rocks were found on the narrow bridge crossing the river, so that if a car had hit it, it had a huge risk of going off the bridge and into the water. Before I tell you what happened, I'll give you a little bit of background. I live in Sydney, Australia, in a pretty dodgy neighborhood, so I am quite used to creepy and not so very nice people, but this experience is the worst I've ever had. My house backs onto a park with quite a few trees, but they are spaced out so it's not like a bushland. It's a nice park with a walkway, and all the houses on my street line up against it, making sort of a long wall of house backyard fences, if that makes sense. Because of this, I have a very small backyard. Now on to the story. I was just about to go to bed, and had finished locking my front door and the windows. All I had to do was lock the back door, but before I did, I decided to open it and have a look outside, just to check the weather and to see if my 2 cats were out there lying around. I was looking around when a faint flicker of light from one of the treetops caught my eye. It was weird, considering there were no lights in the park, and I got worried that there might be a fire starting. I decided to take a closer look, but as soon as I stepped outside, the now clearly visible flame vanished. The flame had come from the tree closest to my back fence, only a few feet away, so it was possible to see shapes and movement even in the darkness. I was certain it was from a lighter. Someone had climbed up the tree and was either lighting a smoke or trying to start a fire. This scared the living shit out of me, because if he was just lighting a cigarette, that meant that he was spying on all of the houses and had just seen me in my pajamas. And if he was starting a fire, the whole park would go up in flames, and the houses too. Australia in summer can be very dangerous, and bushfires damage homes, wildlife, and nature, and kill many people. I ran inside and slammed the door. My father then yelled at me for making such a loud noise and waking him up. I apologized, but didn't tell him what was going on, just in case I was being overly paranoid. I do have severe anxiety. I continued to stand with the back door shut and locked, but watched to see what the man was doing. I saw the lighter once more, and then the end of a cigarette light up. He was smoking. I could see now that my cat was staring at him too, and her fur was all puffed up. And after hearing stories like this, I didn't want him to hurt her, along with the fact that in my area many animals and humans are killed and harmed by people whacked out on drugs, in gangs, or just stupid teens trying to have fun and hurting innocent animals, so I decided to go outside and get her. I ran out and picked up my cat. As I was almost inside, I turned to see what the man was doing. I could see the whites of his eyes. He was staring right at me. I froze for a moment, and then started to go back into the house quickly and quietly. But before I could even get my body halfway through the door, the man lunged out of the tree and onto my back fence. He threw the cigarette at my other cat, who had now climbed out of the flower pot and was hissing. He missed, and my cat is fine. I ran inside and locked the door. The man proceeded to jump into my backyard and bolt for my cat. Luckily, my cat ran through the cat door, and my other cat was still in my arms. I put a large heavy box in front of the cat door to block it. I had once again woken up my dad by being so noisy. He came out yelling at me and telling me to go to my fucking room and shut up as he had to go to work early in the morning. I softly apologized, as all I could manage was a small squeak from being so scared, and I didn't want to piss him off further. I told him to look out back, but not to open the door. He looked at me like I was insane, probably thinking that there was some kind of small rodent outside that had frightened me or attacked the cats. He made an annoyed groan and went to have a look. As soon as he looked outside, he froze. Without looking at me, he told me to call the police and see if I can get my neighbors, one being a cop and the other being a terrifyingly large Fijian man who could kill someone with his bare hands. I called the cops while sprinting to my neighbors' houses and telling them what was happening. When I came back, my dad was yelling at the guy and telling him to get the fuck out of there before the cops come, or my dad decides to kill him himself. A little info on my dad. He is a scary man. Tall, muscular, and ex-army. Nobody messes with him. But this guy, this insane man just stared at him and slowly pulled a knife from his boot and started cutting my screen door, making a hole to try and get through. My screen door has bars on it, and the man could not fit through them. Yet there he was, half his body through the hole, trapped behind the bars, trying to open the glass sliding door, yelling at my father about how he'd never see me again, and the awful things he and his friends would do to me. By this point, one of my neighbors, the cop, had gone into the park with his large German Shepherd and taser, and was planning on jumping over my fence and ambushing the guy. Just as he was about to do so, the police I called arrived and barged past my father, myself, and the other neighbor, the large Fijian man. They then proceeded to tell the man to step away from the door and drop his knife. The man turned away and tried to bolt, but before he could, my neighbor's dog tackled him to the ground and bit him, allowing the cops to arrest the guy. They put him into the car, but he just kept staring at me the whole time, never taking his eyes off of me. I felt so violated and vulnerable. They took our statements, and that's all that has happened. He's in police custody, and we're waiting to see what will happen next. My dad told me that when he looked outside the first time, he saw the man trying to look through our windows with his pants on the ground. He could have possibly been taking a whiz, or, well, the other obvious thing. I was, and still am, very shaken up by this event, and went to stay with my aunt for the night, so I didn't have to be in my house. This happened about 8 years ago. At the time I was working as part of a lighting crew in one of London's West End theatres. We were in the middle of fitting the theatre up for a new show, and this meant long hours, late nights, and early starts. At that time, I lived an hour's train ride from the theatre, so rather than lose sleep commuting, I chose to remain in the theatre at night. We weren't really supposed to stay there overnight, unless we were working there all night, because of insurance and so on. But our manager turned a blind eye during fit-up periods, as long as we kept quiet about it to her bosses. One other person was staying that night, and that was Barry, the head of the stage department, a 6'5" guy with the body of a rugby player gone to seed, and a reputation for not taking shit from anyone. I decided to bed down in one of the dressing rooms, one of the star ones, with a comfy couch and a sweet bathroom, while Barry had a fold-out camp bed and a sleeping bag permanently stored in his office. Whenever I stayed overnight in the theater, I tried not to think too much about the huge, dark, empty building around me, and I always double-locked myself into the dressing room to feel more secure. I was exhausted and fell asleep quickly. However, after a while I was awoken by a familiar muffled thudding noise. It took me a few moments to work out what I was hearing, but when I did, I realized it was the noise of the tip-up seats in the auditorium being pushed down and then let go to spring back up, so the seat pad hit the seat back. It was familiar, because it was what the ushers did at the end of every night to check for lost property. Walk along the rows pushing down each seat in turn. And I was hearing it because it was coming over the show relay, a small speaker placed in every dressing room and common space backstage, which broadcast the audio of whatever was happening on stage, so actors and crew members could hear their cues. As the thudding of the seats continued, I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 2:20 in the morning. I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The only other person in the building other than me was Barry, and while seat repairs were part of Barry's department's job, checking the seats for damage wasn't something he was going to do at that time, which could only mean that there was someone else in the building besides us. Before I have time for the implication of this to sink in, I hear Barry's voice shouting from the end of the dressing room corridor, calling my name. I quickly jumped up, flicked on the light, unlocked the door, and stuck my head out. "There's someone out front," Barry said. His gray hair was sticking straight up, and he looked confused. He had clearly just woken up too. "Should we call the police?" I asked, trying to keep a grip on my rising fear. It wasn't impossible for someone to have snuck into the theater during the day and hidden away somewhere until they thought it was deserted. But the only reasons I could think to do that were either to commit a robbery or have a place to sleep for the night. Walking along the rows pushing the seats down was just plain weird. "Let's go and see what's what first," Barry replied. So in true horror movie style, rather than being sensible and getting the hell away from the creepy thing, we headed towards the auditorium together. On our way, we passed by our tool store, and I grabbed a claw hammer as a possible weapon. Barry gave me a look, but fuck it. I was a 5'2" skinny little woman. If we were about to face down something, I wanted to be prepared. As we walked through the stage left wing, I could still hear the seats thudding, although it was more muffled now because it was coming from behind the metal safety curtain. But once we went through the past door and into the auditorium, the noise stopped. The auditorium wasn't pitch black. The exit signs stay illuminated at all times, and there was just enough light coming from them to be able to make out a figure near the back of the seating area, but not enough light to see any details. "Hey mate, what the fuck are you doing here?" Barry called out, and began to walk towards the figure. I followed closely behind, not wanting to be too far from Barry in case someone else was lurking in the dark. Halfway along the wall there was a small panel which hid the switch for the working lights. These aren't the decorative fittings you see when you come to watch a show, but half a dozen fluorescent strips which, when on, filled the place with a harsh white light. Gripping the hammer tightly in one hand, I ran my other hand along the wall until I found the panel. Then I opened it and turned the lights on. Blinking in the sudden harsh light, I looked across at the now fully illuminated male figure, and was both shocked and creeped out to see that I recognized him, or at least I recognized his clothes. He was one of the street people who hung out in the area around the theater, and he always wore the same thing, a pair of bike leathers that were worn and patched to hell, and a filthy gray hoodie several sizes too big for his skinny frame. I'd never seen his face, as he always wore his hood pulled up, and always hung his head in such a way that you could see nothing but shadows inside. It wasn't this that creeped me out though, but what he did, or rather what he didn't do. Every time I had seen him, he had been standing completely still in the middle of the pavement, legs slightly apart, shoulders hunched, and face turned to the ground, while streams of tourists and workers passed around him. The first time I had spotted him, I had even wondered if he was some kind of performance artist, and I stood and watched him from behind to see if I could see if he was ever going to move. He didn't. If someone barged him a little as they were walking past, he just corrected his stance. Other than that, he didn't move or look up. After that, I often saw him, never in the exact same place, but always around the same area, and always standing completely still. He seemed so otherworldly and weird, he really started to freak me out, and I'd change direction or cross the street to avoid going directly past him. Although he must have been walking along the rows of seats before, he had stopped moving now, and he didn't seem to give any indication that he'd heard Barry's question. The man was facing us, but his head was bowed, so I still couldn't see his features as they were deep inside his hood. I also noticed a smell that must have been coming from him, a strong, feral tang of unwashed skin and filthy clothes. "I said, what the fuck are you doing here?" Barry repeated, taking a step towards the man. Finally, the man seemed to realize we were there, and he looked up, letting the hood slip back from his head. He had a thin, almost skeletal face, very, very dark skin, and his hair was a mass of snaked and knotted dreads. One of the spookiest things was the whites of his sunken-in eyes weren't. They were totally bloodshot red. When he opened his mouth, I could see his teeth were mostly stumps. I thought he was going to speak, but instead he just let out a long, keening wail, which sounded like no noise a human should ever make. "Shit," I muttered, taking an involuntary step back, gripping the hammer hard enough to turn my knuckles white. As the keening grew louder and more desperate, spittle started to come out of the man's mouth and form snail trails down his chin, settling in odd patches of sparse facial hair. I looked at Barry, and was shocked to see that he appeared almost as freaked out as I was. If the man tried to attack us or run away, I know Barry wouldn't have hesitated to tackle him to the ground, but I could absolutely sense Barry's reluctance to go near him. The keening was turning into howling, the man's mouth now so wide open it looked like his face was about to split in two. Barry and I locked eyes. He gave a small jerk of his hand in the direction of the door we'd come through a few moments before, and almost as one, we set off running back the way we came. We fumbled our way through the past door, which was on a number padlock, so once we got back into the stage, we knew the crazy man couldn't follow us. My legs were shaking so much, I was surprised I didn't collapse on the way to Barry's office, from where he called the police, the awful howling still going on, now being broadcasted to us over the show relay. Apparently, the police took the man away with no trouble. Not that I witnessed this. I had no desire to ever see him, and stayed backstage while Barry dealt with them. When we spoke to the police a few days later, they told us because of his mental state, they weren't going to charge him. But as he was clearly insane, he was sectioned and sent to a mental hospital. One interesting thing was the police never found out who he was. They were pretty sure he was originally from West Africa, and that he was in his 30s. But no one had reported him missing. He had no criminal record, no documents, or indeed any other possessions on him. And he himself wouldn't, or couldn't, tell them his name. How and why he ended up in London, and why he was in this theater that night, will always be a mystery. I first moved out of my parents' house in 2008. I was 20, I had a 2-year-old daughter, and gosh darn it, I wanted to assert my independence and prove that I wasn't living with my parents because I couldn't live on my own. Overall, it was a relatively dumb idea. I moved to a cool part of town, next to campus, next to one of the arts districts, but in a really beautiful neighborhood I always wanted to live in. But it was a 15-minute drive away from the suburb my parents lived in. And since I worked nights, I'd spend way too much time driving back and forth so my mom could babysit on the nights I worked. Despite the inconvenience, the neighborhood did not disappoint. I was in a small apartment building right in the middle of beautiful Victorian houses, houses that sell for upwards of $1 million. Lovely neighbors, quiet area, no problems with anyone, ever. It felt safe. There was a neighborhood watch and everything. I think there was only one incident of car break-ins in my 2 years there, and even then they just hit the cars that were unlocked. No smashed windows or damaged property. On the screen now is a picture of my old place. I was upstairs at the end of the building. As evident in the picture, there's no reason for anyone other than me or my people to be near my door or window. The guy who lived right next to me, who I'll also refer to as neighbor, was a quiet guy who immersed himself in schoolwork. He never had people over, and wasn't known for drunken antics. I don't know why they blurred the image, but the blurred part is his window, his door, my door, and then my window. This story takes place right around the end of my second year there. 2 years of nothing remarkable other than the aforementioned car break-ins. Around May of 2010, I was outside cleaning the glass on the doors and windows and decobwebbing the cheap black iron patio furniture I got at Target. The windows are tall. I am short. In order for me to clean the upper portions of the window, I had to stand on one of the chairs that reach. And that's when I noticed something. Lip prints. Well, just one set of lips. On the window. Pretty high up, too. I couldn't have reached them if I wasn't on the chair. At the time I was mostly annoyed, thinking maybe neighbor had friends over and one of his drunk friends kissed my window. Because who else would be near my window? After that, I always made a point to see if the lips showed up again. They didn't, so it confirmed my drunk neighbor theory in my mind. Now this is where everyone groans and rolls their eyes. Trust me, I know. I was young and dumb, but even that's not an excuse. Because of where I lived, neighborhood-wise and within the building, there were plenty of nights I'd leave the blinds open. And not only that, but the way the apartment was set up was in an L shape. Living room, kitchen, and bedroom all in a straight line back, and then the bathroom off to the side of the bedroom. My daughter's bed was toward the inside of the bedroom, and mine was at the end of the straight line back. I liked the way the light would come through the trees in the morning. It was really a beautiful sight, and I liked waking up to it. I know, it was a dumb choice. And here's another thing that makes me want to curl up and die. Many nights, my daughter at this point in the story, 4 years old, would sleep in my bed. Until she didn't, which was probably around the 4th of July if I remember correctly. She attributed this to, the tall man that watches me sleep. I don't like it. But in my defense, this kid was known for saying some really creepy shit. One time she told me a ghost of a baby pig, named Baby Pig Ghost, would talk to her, and he was sad because people tore him apart. And she was sad because the other ghost pigs wanted to hurt me. So her saying something like that was super creepy, but I didn't think there was literally a tall man watching us sleep. But to appease her, and because I was thoroughly creeped out by what she said, I'd leave the blinds down at night. Most nights I'd wake up at 3 or 4 because of my work schedule. I figured my daughter was just being weird again. But that imagery sticks with you, I guess. And on to the night that put me in therapy and turned me into the most paranoid person you could ever meet. It was early August. I was asleep in my bed. I went down pretty early. My bedroom door was open like it always was. I was fast asleep facing the living room like I always was. The blinds were down and closed, like they had been for a month. But the string was wonky, so one portion of the blinds always had about an inch or two of space between the windowsill. All the lights were off, but the patio light was on outside. I randomly woke up and looked down at my phone to see what time it was. Just a few minutes after 3. I was annoyed, thinking that there was no way I was going to fall back asleep. And that's when I saw it. Outside of the window, I saw the silhouette of a tall person through the blinds. He was standing completely still. He was standing so still for so long that I started to think I was crazy. I thought I was seeing things. And that's when he sat in one of the chairs outside. I was completely frozen in sheer terror. I couldn't move a muscle. Texting or calling for help seemed out of the question. I was afraid he'd see the light from my phone or hear me. But then again, he sat there for so long that I convinced myself I just saw a shadow and that nothing was there. And then again, he moved. He stood back up and turned around. He stepped closer to the window and paused. He got right up to the window and paused again. And that's when he leaned over and was looking through the 2 inches of space between the windowsill and the bottom of the blinds. He stood there for longer than what seemed like feasibly possible in that bent-over position. His head didn't move. He just stood there while I kept my eyes mostly shut. I thought if there was any way he could possibly see me with my eyes open looking at him, it'd make him snap and he'd bust in. Eventually he stood back up and walked out of view. Then I heard the screen door creak open. I can only assume he tried the doorknob, but thankfully I wasn't too much of a dumb shit that I left my door unlocked. Then I heard the screen door shut again, and after that there was nothing. After I heard the door shut, and I didn't see him come back to the window, I checked my phone. It was 3:48 a.m. I quietly slid out of bed and crawled toward the bathroom and threw up. I waited until the sun came up before I called the cops. I can't explain why I was so afraid to move or make noise until then, but I was paralyzed with fear in the bathroom until then. 2 officers showed up, and I stepped outside to talk to them. And it came as little surprise to see that the lip prints were on the window again, roughly in the same spot. The police took their photos, and the report was filed. I never slept there again. With the police report, I was able to cancel the lease renewal I had signed, and I moved back in with my parents. I grew up in a very small town called Chesney that's located in South Carolina. At the time, the population I think was less than 1,000. It's the type of town where most people know each other. At the time, I was about 20 and visiting my parents for a few weeks during the summer. I remember sitting at the kitchen table during the day, talking about her getting a frantic phone call from my dad, telling her that the police were everywhere near where he was working that day, in Greer, South Carolina, and that someone had been murdered. So after hanging up the phone, she goes and checks the locks and turns on the news, and it's all over the local news about an older man getting shot to death in his home about 20 minutes from our house. Living in a small town, where the main criminal offense was theft or drugs, and everyone knows each other, this was shocking for everyone. After my dad came home, we sat there and discussed what had happened. My mom, me, my younger brother, and my dad. My dad said that he hoped it was just some freak happening, and that the person would be captured. Later that night, I had a cousin who came by. He happened to have a habit of hanging out with less than reputable people. But overall he was very harmless, especially to his family. He asked if he could spend the night at my parents' house since he was going to be working with my dad the next day, and my mom said of course. He asked if he could bring his friend. His friend's nickname was Big Country, and my mom was a little hesitant because she didn't really know the person, but my cousin told her that they had been friends for years. But today Big Country called out of nowhere to ask him for a place to stay, and that he was going through some hard times and trying to get back on his feet. So my mom, being as naive as she was, / still is, said sure, and my dad even agreed to let Big Country work with them the following day, as my dad co-owns a construction business and can always use the help. Later that night, Larry and Big Country arrive at our house, and right away we notice that Big Country turns on the television and is almost glued to the news. After a few minutes, we're all sitting in the living room and my dad was trying to be nice and sociable and asked Big Country what his name was. Big Country replies with, "Why do you want to know that?" And my dad just looked at him and said that he was trying to be nice and sociable. Big Country then replies that his name is Patrick. and my dad continues to try to make conversation and notices that Big Country / Patrick is still intrigued with the news. My dad then says, "That's horrible what happened, isn't it?" And I remember this conversation clear as day because of how uncomfortable I felt. Big Country looks at my dad and says that everyone has reasons for doing what they do. And then my dad kind of ended the conversation, and him and my mom went into their bedroom, and then called me and my brother and cousin Larry into the bedroom to ask him how the hell Larry knew this guy. Larry answered with, "We used to hang out for years, but we lost touch." And my dad said, "Well, he seems kind of weird to me." And Larry told him that he was just a little strange, but was harmless. My dad tells him to make sure that he was out by 7 a.m. and to make sure they both stayed in the spare bedroom, because he didn't want Big Country wandering around the house, and that Larry was responsible for him. Larry agreed, and my parents went to bed. My brother and I then went back into the living room and sat down. As awkward as it was, my brother asked Big Country if he had any bags or anything he needed to get out of his car before we turned the alarm system on. I remember Big Country turning and looking at my brother and telling him that anything he needed, he already had in the house. And that was my cue to leave and go to my old room where I locked the door. The next morning, as we got up and went to eat breakfast, everyone except Big Country, who was still sleeping, my mom casually asked how everyone slept, and everyone said they slept okay. Except for Larry, who said that he slept like shit because Big Country kept pacing the floor and couldn't sleep. While we all thought that that was weird, we were just all happy to get him out of the house. About an hour later, my dad, cousin Larry, and Big Country left the house, and my mom said that she had the worst feeling all night and that she was so glad that they were gone. Skip ahead about 4 days. No one has solved the murder case in Greer, or has any suspects, so everyone kind of let their guard down. I remember being outside doing work for my parents when the house phone started ringing, and I went inside to answer, and it was a family member telling me that 2 more people had been found bound and killed. An older lady in her 80s and her daughter. I don't remember the exact location, but somewhere not far from my family's house. I remember thinking that it was so weird that things like that didn't happen. I think it was later that day that a news report / sheriff's news conference said they thought it was connected to the Greer murder, and that we possibly had a serial killer on our hands, and for everyone to keep their doors locked and to try and make sure to keep their eyes open and be observant. That sent panic through the entire community. I remember a few family members asking my dad to borrow a gun. These are people who had sworn to never own a gun. Not long after that, my dad asked my grandmother, who lived a little distance away, to please come and stay with us until the crime was solved. He also asked my brother and me to please stay with my mom and grandma during the day, and since I was visiting and had nothing better to do, I agreed. He said that he wouldn't feel safe going to work unless he knew that they were safe. That night, needless to say, I got no sleep. Every noise that I heard I got up to check on, noises that I normally wouldn't pay attention to. Even though the alarm was set, I was still expecting the worst case each time I got up. The next day as we sat at breakfast, my dad asked my mom to please be careful if she had to go out, and please have one of us go with her. She agreed and said that she hoped whoever was behind this was caught. Unfortunately, later that day as I was watching television, the local news anchor broke a story that 2 more people had been shot. I remember this location was about 10 minutes or so from our house, and that they thought it was linked. I remember the news anchor encouraging everyone to stay indoors because this person doesn't seem to mind killing multiple people during the daytime. This shooting happened at a furniture store, and 1 man had been killed, and his daughter, who had come in to check on him, got shot as well, but she was still alive at the time. She sadly died on July 4th from her injuries. Once again, everyone was in panic mode because this was now 5 people who had been killed in just a few days. Later that night, I remember watching more news broadcasts saying that some places were thinking about shutting down early, and that with 4th of July coming up in just a few days, that people needed to be very, very careful. On the 4th of July, for the first time in years, no one in my family really celebrated, out of fear. Skip ahead to July 6th. We were all still in fear that the serial killer would strike again. We were all sitting in the living room watching television, my brother, me, my mom, dad, and my grandmother, when a news anchor broke in again, and we all assumed the worst, that someone else had been murdered. But the news anchor said that the police believed they had shot and killed the guy who was responsible for the 5 killings. We all breathed a sigh of relief, until the news anchor said his name was Patrick Burris, and showed a mugshot. It was the same guy that had spent the night with us. It was Big Country. The news anchor said that Patrick had a long list of previous charges, and was with 2 people, and that they had broken into an empty house, and that the neighbors called the police, and they showed up. Patrick started shooting at them, and they returned fire and killed him. They later said that they suspected he was going to kill the other 2 people he had been with that evening. And one last thing to note. A witness had said earlier in the week that they had seen a guy who may be a suspect. And while the police put out a sketch, almost everything about the sketch was different than Patrick Big Country Burris. That's why no one really suspected him. Years ago, I used to live in a pretty populated city. I lived with my family. My mom, dad, sister, and my 2 dogs. We lived in a 2-story house in a suburb near the city. My dad worked downtown, so he was down there frequently. I should also mention that around the time of this story, I was about 8 or 9. This particular day, a Friday in the middle of summer, was just any normal day. My sister was sleeping over at a friend's house, and my mom and I had stayed home all day watching movies. That evening, we decided to go meet my dad downtown and get some ice cream, since he was just about to get off work. Fast forward about 3 hours later. It's about 9 or so, and it's dark out. Since my mom and I drove her car to meet my dad, and my dad has his own car, we were separated, but arrived home at the same time. I was in my dad's car. My mom pulls into the driveway first, and I noticed when her headlights shined on our fence, the gate was wide open. We knew for certain that we'd shut it and locked it, having 2 huskies and all. My mom got out of her car and gasped. My dad stops the car and we both get out. My mom is crouched down, checking the damage of the fence gate. Apparently whoever broke in, we assumed, used some kind of tool to pry it open, since almost half the boards on it were bent or broken off. The next thing I noticed was that both of our dogs were freaking the hell out. Then I realized the window by the door was broken. My heart dropped. By this point, I was legitimately scared. My dad pulled out his pocket knife and went inside. I also grabbed my bat, which was under the porch. My mom just stood by the front door, begging my dad not to go in. He told her to call the cops, which she did. My dad and I slowly went into the house. The first thing we noticed was the little TV in the kitchen was gone. Fuck, my dad swore. Now I was more angry than scared. Whoever broke in must have ransacked the whole house. That probably meant the living room TV and my PlayStation. I took a knife from the drawer and put it in my pocket, just in case. I don't know why my dad didn't stop me since I was only 9, but I guess he didn't care based on the current situation. Still unnerved, my dad and I inched through the first floor of our house. When we checked the living room, of course the main TV was stolen. When we let the dogs out, Still freaking out, in the front yard, we had an invisible fence so they couldn't leave. The house was silent. That's when we heard it. Footsteps. But there was more than one pair. There were at least 2 of these goons in my house. It sounded like they were in my parents' bedroom. Obviously, they knew we were home. They probably ran to a nearby closet to hide in. I gripped my bat tighter. "Whoever the fuck you are, I won't hesitate to blow your head off," my dad yelled upstairs. I'd never seen my dad get this angry before. My dad didn't actually own a gun. He obviously said that to make them scared. And it must have worked, because we heard the footsteps shift from the master bedroom, near the stairs, to the other side of the house, which must have been either my sister's or my room. Right about then was when we heard the sirens approaching our house. I heard a very loud and distinct "shit" from the upstairs of the house. Once the police stopped in front of our house, my mom came rushing into the room. I quickly told her that there were at least 2 goons hiding in the upstairs, and that some stuff was stolen. Then we heard banging on the front door. "Police!" I rushed to the front door and let them in. "We have an emergency call saying there was a break-in here," he said. "Yes," my mom said, crying. She said something along the lines of, "They broke in through the back while we weren't here. They're upstairs. They broke a window and—" "We understand. We'll go check it out," the cop said. I suddenly felt safe. They went upstairs, and not even a minute later we heard yelling and "Get down!" Soon after, the cops had the 2 criminals handcuffed and were escorting them down the stairs. One of them looked to be in his mid-30s. He had a long, unkempt orange beard and a mustache. I remember he was wearing a baseball cap and jeans. The other guy was even younger, and dressed in all black, and was apparently wearing a ski mask, since the cop who was escorting him was carrying one. The cops told us they were hiding in the closet in my room. They were also both armed with pistols, which freaked me out. We also learned that everything they stole was in a large garbage bag. By then, many of our neighbors had gathered around our house, trying to see what was going on. I distinctly remember the cops driving away with them in the back. The bearded one in the baseball cap gave me a blank, creepy stare, and I'm not going to forget it anytime soon. Like I said, when this happened I was only 8 or 9, so I was traumatized for a very long time. After the incident, I always made sure that all the doors and windows were locked at night, and had one of our huskies sleep on the end of my bed. We also installed a house alarm soon after. The thing that disturbs me the most is thinking about what would have happened if we didn't go out for ice cream. Would they have broken in anyway? Would they have killed us? Had they been planning it for a while? It still sends chills up my spine to this day. I was about 25 when this occurred. My boyfriend and I had been out visiting with friends, and we left their house late, around 2 a.m. I've never been much of a drinker, so I did the driving. On our way back, we decided to call in some omelets from the Waffle House, which is the only place you can get takeout in the super early morning hours. We arrived at the Waffle House and went inside to pick up our orders. As I was paying for the order, a young man to my left began pacing and mumbling angrily, muttering something I couldn't understand. I didn't think much of it, since most diner patrons are either drunk or truck drivers at that time of the day. When I collected the food and turned to leave, I noticed a young woman outside of the diner. She too was angrily pacing back and forth, grimacing and cursing. The young man followed me into the parking lot. I sidestepped the woman to get to my car. The young man then went and got in another car, and the young woman sat in the passenger seat. Whatever, I thought. Tweakers. As I put my car in reverse, the car with the 2 tweakers screeched to a halt behind my car, pinning us in the parking spot. Within seconds, the man was knocking ferociously on my driver's side window and yelling at me. My boyfriend and I exchanged confused glances, and I unrolled the car window about an inch. The conversation went something like this.
You stole my girlfriend's wallet and you'd better give it back right now.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I have my own wallet, and that's it.
You fucking stole it from the counter and we're getting it back one way or another.
Dude, I didn't steal your shit. Move your car or I'm going to back into it.
You give it to me right now, or give me yours or you're fucking dead.
I rolled up the window and backed my car up a few inches. He continued to scream at me through the window, then leapt back into his car with his girlfriend. They peeled backwards, and I exited the parking lot. At that point, my boyfriend and I were amused more than anything, and we re-entered the highway. Just then, we hear the same car roar up behind us. The man was driving like an absolute maniac to dodge other cars, traffic lights, and stop signs, until he got so close to us that their car nearly rammed our back bumper. I weaved in and out of sparse traffic as safely as I could in an attempt to throw them off of our route. Each time, he'd managed to pull up behind us again. He clicked his headlights on and off the bright setting and leaned on the horn. Inside our car, it was blinking and deafening. I sure as hell wasn't going home so this tweaked, unhinged couple could know where I lived. I swear it was almost like I could hear him screaming, even over the blaring car horn. My boyfriend and I didn't talk much, as I suppose we were both shocked and trying to figure out what to do. Fuck this, I told him. We're going to the police station. I doubled back, the car bearing down on us. When I pulled into the police station, they followed. I locked my car doors, picked up my cell and began to ring the station, because I sure as hell wasn't going to get out of my car. The man practically ran out of his car and up to my window, again banging and yelling. I'd gotten way beyond concerned and scared, to absolutely pissed.
We want our goddamn money.
Leave me the fuck alone. I'll let the cops search me for your girlfriend's fucking wallet. He was silent. I'm on the phone with the cops right now.
If you don't have it, I guess you don't have it.
He then sprinted back to his car with his sour-faced girlfriend and burned rubber out of there. I stayed in the police station's parking lot for a while, talking to the cops on duty. When we finally left at about 3:30 a.m., I still made several loops through town before eventually heading home, arriving after 4 a.m. Legally, nothing came out of the incident. I had no idea what the couple's names were, nor did I get a license plate number. We gave the cops a description of their physical appearances and vehicle, but they seemed far more interested in making sure that I wasn't drunk. Thanks, fellas. I'm fairly certain that maniac couple was pulling a strong-armed con job, or else they were genuinely convinced that I'd mysteriously and magically stolen the girl's wallet, even though they were pacing and muttering as soon as I'd entered the diner, before I'd paid for the takeout, and that methamphetamine psychosis was responsible for the bizarre severity of their behavior. Anyway, fuck those assholes. My omelet was cold and rubbery by the time I got home. I'm a 33-year-old man, and this incident takes place during October a few years ago. I was living with my 3-year-old pit bull, Harley, in a very secluded area in Northern California. I am self-employed, working in an industry some people may call criminal, but I refer to it as gardening. My property is about 20 acres of wooded land, located on a small mountain, and my nearest neighbor is about 3 miles away. This property has been in my family for decades, and it will forever remain ours. As for personal information, that is all I feel comfortable sharing. The area I live in is known to have a lot of gardeners, and October is the time that our crops are ready for cultivation. This means that around this time, we are flooded with transients looking for work. I took my truck to town for a few new sets of clippers and work supplies. Upon reaching the garden store, I was approached by one of these transients looking for work. "Hey man, you need any help with your crops this season?" A man, appearing to be 20 years old, with dreads asked me. "I'm not in that line of work, thank you," I replied in a rush. Back when I had first started gardening, I had hired one of these transients to help me out with work. Unfortunately, I got one of the scumbags, which resulted in me losing about $5,000. That is the reason I only hire friends now, and also the reason I don't come to town without the hardcover on my truck during this time of year. I make my way into the store, and after about 10 minutes or so I find what I need and head towards the front. Just before I make it to the register, one of my neighbors, John, walks in. John and I have known each other for most of our lives. We were both raised in the area and help each other a lot during harvesting. John smiles at me, walks up and says, "Hey, I tried to call you yesterday, but your phone is off. We meeting up this weekend to cut some trees?" Shit, I guess I forgot to pay my phone again. Yeah, dude, that sounds good. Be at my place around 8. Before John could even respond, a voice comes out of nowhere with, "I can help too. I work cheap." It actually scared me with how loud and suddenly that was said, and I turned my head to see the same guy who was asking for work out front, now standing behind me. "Sorry guy, not the line of work you're thinking of. We're loggers," was my immediate response. Everyone around here knows what the main moneymaker is, and it isn't logging, but I was hoping it would still throw him off and get him to leave us alone. After all, we could be loggers. The guy with dreads hesitates, and at this time John says, "Hey, I'll catch you this weekend. Take care," and walks off into the store. I look back at the young man with dreads and say, "Wish I could help, man, but you'll find some work." He looks at me with an almost evil glare for a second, before he is all cheery again and says, "Hey, no problem. Good luck with your logging," before reaching around me, putting a soda on the counter, and rushing out the doors. The guy working the register, now waiting on me to move up and pay, says, "Gotta love this time of year," sarcastically. "Oh yeah," I reply with a quick chuckle. I pay for my things, hop into my truck and head back home. By the time I made it out to my place, it was dusk. During this time of year, Harley is outside all day keeping watch of the property, and will meet me on the porch around nightfall to come inside. He was there waiting for me, and we both made our way inside. Fast forward a few hours. I'm watching a movie in the living room, and Harley is asleep on the couch next to me. I had just started to doze off when Harley starts flipping out. I am jolted awake and immediately rush into my room to grab my pistol, thinking it might be an intruder. I run back to the front door and swing it open, only to see my trash can knocked over and trash strewn around my porch. Harley slides past me and runs off the porch towards the woods barking. I, figuring it was probably a wild animal digging through the trash, start yelling for Harley to get back inside. After locking him inside, it took me about 15 minutes to pick up the trash and put the can back on the corner of the porch where it belonged. Just as I was reaching for the door to go back inside, I hear twigs snap. I look out towards where the sound came from, but can't see a thing. I then decide I should at least take a peek around my property to make sure everything was alright, even though I was confident it was a raccoon or something. I open the door for Harley, grab my flashlight from the table by the door, and make my way to the wooded area where my crops are. After a half hour or so, Harley hasn't made a peep, and I haven't heard or seen anything, so we head back to the house. By this time it's probably 10 p.m., and I decide to rack out for the night. I wake up the next morning, now Friday, at about 7 a.m. I do my normal wake-up routine, and once again go out to check my crops. When all is said and done, it's about 11:20 a.m. I remember specifically, because that is when I looked at the time and remembered I needed to turn my phone back on. Being the smart person I am, I forgot to pick up a top-up card while in town the day before. I don't have a bank account. So I once again take my truck back into town, leaving Harley to roam the property. I pull up to the only grocery store in town and make my way inside. I decide that while I'm there, I'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone and also get my grocery shopping for the week done. After completing my shopping, I make my way out to my truck and load up. I go to unlock the hatch of my hardtop and see that the lock/handle piece is completely mangled. I can't even fit my key in, and that's when I notice it isn't even locked. I know for a fact that I had it locked, so I go into a panic mode and check to make sure nothing is missing. There isn't anything missing that I can see, so I angrily load up my groceries and open my car door to leave. Then a familiar voice once again comes out of nowhere and says, "Hey, you looking for any help today with your trees?" I spin around to see the guy with dreads, once again asking to work for me. "Dude, I told you I don't need any help. Try bugging someone else." "Oh right, you're a logger," he replies with a wink, before slowly walking towards the store. He makes it about 15 feet or so away, and I finally climb inside my truck. Then I hear him shout, "Hey, you might want to fix that lock on your truck." That caught me off guard, and I wanted to know why the hell he said that. So I jumped back out of my truck and started power walking towards him while shouting, "How did you know my truck lock is broken? Did you do that shit?" "No, man, I can clearly see that it is broken," he says with a really weird smile. I slow down my pace as I come to the realization that I may be overreacting. I glance over my shoulder at the truck, and it is pretty obvious the lock is broken. I also notice that one of the store employees is on a smoke break out front and watching us. Shit, maybe dude only saw the lock, I think to myself. I don't say another word to the guy. I immediately go and hop in my truck and head home. The last thing I need to do is make a scene with a random person and have the police notified. I arrive home at about 1:30 p.m. and top up my phone, call the local mechanic, and then call John. "Hey man, just wanted to let you know that someone busted my lock last night on my truck. It had to have been in town yesterday when I saw you. I would keep a close eye on all your stuff while we have all these workers in the area. I am thinking it was the guy with dreads from the store, but I can't be sure. Either way, watch your shit when you're in town."
Fucking hippies,
he mutters.
"Thanks for the warning. It is that time of year again. Well shit man, I'm in the middle of some work. We still on for tomorrow morning?"
"No problem. Yeah, that sounds good. See you when you get here."
"Nice. I'll see you tomorrow, and thanks for the warning,"
he said before we both hung up. I ate a quick lunch, then grabbed what I needed to get some work done in the crops. Then I went to do my harvesting. The way I do my harvesting always depends on the weather that year. This year we were having rain on a regular schedule, so I had to be in the fields every day checking for mold and harvesting any flowers that I thought were ready. This process takes quite a while to complete, so I always plan on being in the fields for the long haul. I'd say about 2 hours into the work, Harley decided to show up and stick around for the rest of the time I worked. A few hours later, it started getting dark, so I picked up the bags and we headed home. I hung the flowers, and I went to take a shower to wash off all the sweat. I was in the shower for only a few moments when I hear Harley going absolutely insane. I have never heard my dog get this aggressive. My heart started pounding and I turned off the water. That was when I hear the glass shattering from one of my windows. I'm panicking, trying to get out of the shower so I can make my way to my gun, when I hear what sounds like Harley jumping out the window and outside. I say this because I hear more glass shatter as Harley is flipping out, and the barking starts to get farther away. I didn't bother grabbing a towel. I started sprinting straight to my room, slipping on the floor along the way. Everything felt like it was happening so fast, yet I was moving at a turtle's pace. As quickly as I could, I jumped into some boxers and tossed on my boots before grabbing my gun and sprinting to the living room. The big window just behind my couch had been smashed in, and there was no sign of Harley. I ripped open the front door with my weapon in front of me, calling for Harley to come back, and also whoever was out there to come out before getting shot. Out of nowhere, I hear a blood-curdling scream, and Harley sounds like he's in a fight. I start bolting in their direction, but can't see a damn thing in the dark, forcing me to run back to my house and grab a light before I can venture into the woods. I am moving at breakneck speeds, dodging trees as I clumsily sprint along the tiny trails I have made, the scream still echoing through the night, letting me know which way to go. I was heading into my crops. Then I heard the most gut-wrenching sound. The screams of this man were replaced by the sound of Harley screeching in pain. I don't know how it was possible, but I started running even faster, screaming Harley's name the whole time. Finally, not far in front of me, I see what I assumed was the location of the fight. I can see light through the trees ahead. As I'm running, Harley's whines start getting quieter and turn almost to whimpers. I finally get to where this light is, and I see a flashlight laying on the ground. A few feet from that, I see Harley laying on the ground, and no more than 3 feet from him, I see the shape of a man on the ground, both of them lying in a puddle of blood. My heart is going 1,000,000 miles a minute, and my mind is trying to comprehend what I am seeing. My first reaction was to check Harley, but just as I took another step closer, the man on the ground started to scream again. Harley then started trying to move again, but I quickly told him to lay still, hoping he would listen, all the while my eyes are trained on this person lying on their stomach on the ground. Then, something clicked as I was staring at the back of this person's head. They had fucking dreadlocks. That realization clicked something inside of me, and I rushed over and grabbed their shoulder and flipped him on their back. It was the fucking guy from the store, the transient who kept bugging me for work. I don't know what happened, but I completely froze. It was like we were all stuck in time. I stood there staring at this guy, and he was now staring at me. I stood there in a trance for what felt like 5 minutes, before I was brought back to reality by him saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I'm sorry." He started trying to crawl away, and that was once again when Harley started trying to move, all the while whining in pain. The next thing I remember is holding my gun out in front of me, pointing it at this man's head, and then getting flooded with thoughts. What in the hell do I do? If I kill this guy, I'm screwed. That is life in prison right there. But if I turn him in or let him go, I would probably end up in jail for life for different reasons. I was now stuck with the most important decision of my life. Hell, this could end my life. My thought process finally started to get back on track, and I slowly knelt down to Harley while keeping my gun trained on this guy. I start trying to glance at Harley to see his injuries, but once again the man starts trying to crawl away. "If you fucking move, I'll blow your brains out," I growl at him. I start looking over this guy and see that his right leg is badly mangled, as well as his right arm. The blood seemed to be pouring out of this guy. I hadn't even noticed up until this point, but it looked like a steady stream. The injuries looked severe enough that I figured he wouldn't be able to get away or do anything if I took the time to check my dog, so that's what I did. I set my gun on the ground next to Harley and started to assess his injuries. He appeared to have been stabbed with something. I could see a wound on his leg and in his side. He started lightly licking my hand, letting out a few light whimpers. I couldn't hold back. I started to tear up right there. This did not look good. There were no vets within 30 miles, and even then, the dirt road to get to the main road is extremely brutal. The bouncing around was not an option at this point. In a fit of rage, I picked up my gun and stood up, staring at the guy with a death stare. If my dog died, this guy was going to die. That was how I was basing my decision, and I even told him that. He started bawling and screaming, "I'm sorry, I didn't have a choice. The dog was going to kill me." That's what happens when you try and rob people. You fucking stabbed my dog. Then it hit me. He still has a weapon. "Where the hell is the knife you stabbed my dog with?" "I didn't stab it with a knife," he sobbed. "I used a stick. I didn't want to, I had no choice." So many things were going through my mind. Is this even real? How did this happen? I should shoot this guy right now. I still didn't know what to do. It was like my brain was thrown into a tornado. I could barely complete half a thought before another took over my brain. "How the fuck did you get here?" "I walked here. Please let me go. I need to get to the hospital." "You aren't going anywhere unless I decide so," I replied coldly. "How the hell did you find out where I lived?" He hesitated before breaking into more sobs. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I broke into your truck yesterday, and you came out while I was in the back. The next thing I know, I'm at your place." This really caught me off guard. What the fuck? He had been in my truck yesterday. I drove this fucker to my house without knowing he was there. But even if he rode to my house, how would he know the turns to take on the dirt roads to get back? Those are like a maze. I called him out on this. "I don't know, I just guessed," he replied. I knew this was a bullshit answer. You don't just accidentally find your way out to my house and then into my fields. I stepped closer to him and raised my left leg. "Oh, really?" I say, before stomping down on his mangled right leg. He screamed so loud, I thought my ears were going to burst. Another reason you should not break into someone's property when they live in the middle of nowhere. Yes, they might not be able to scream for help if they needed it, but that works two ways. I pulled my leg back and asked again, "How the hell did you find out where I live?" His sobbing continued. I paid attention. I knew you weren't a logger. I looked for every turn and I explored your property when you were inside that night. You almost caught me when I knocked your trash can over. Please, I'm really sorry. Call the police. I'll go to jail." It all started to click, and his answers started to make me even more angry, if that's possible. No one is calling the police. I am not going to jail for you. I knew that if I called the police, or even brought him in, he knows where I live and what is on my property. He would no doubt be asked why he was trying to rob me, and then now I'm in a lot more trouble than him. On the flip side, if I don't take him in and he dies here, I'm probably up for murder. If they find the body. That is where my mind stuck. If they find the body. The only way I saw the opportunity of staying out of jail was if I hide a dark secret for the rest of my life. My mind was made. No one was ever going to know about this. At this point, an eerie calm came over me. I can't really explain it. It was as if my anger was completely gone, and I was able to think clearly again. I backed away from the guy and went and sat by Harley. He wasn't moving, and his breathing was very shallow. "Harley, hey good boy," I whispered to him as he lay there. Once again, my eyes started to tear up, and I held back sobs as he tried to cuddle up to me. I picked up his head and placed it on my lap. "I love you, Harley," I repeated as I stroked his matted fur. I watched his body as it rose and fell ever so slightly, until it didn't rise. Almost immediately, I wasn't filled with sadness anymore. I was filled with hatred, and the source was still breathing on the ground in front of me. I slowly moved Harley's head off my lap, stand up, and make my way back to the guy. I looked down at him as I'm clutching my gun. Was I really about to do this? I raised the gun and pointed it at his face. He started crying and begging me not to shoot him. What was I doing? I am not a murderer. I can't take this guy's life for this horrible mistake. I slowly lower my gun and say, "I'm not going to shoot you." He immediately starts screaming, "Thank you. I'm so sorry. I won't tell anyone about your crops. I'll say..." I cut him off. I said I'm not going to shoot you. I didn't say you weren't going to die. His face went from relief to confusion in an instant. "It looks like my dog got you pretty good. I bet it hurts," I said as I went and sat by Harley's body. I could tell this was about to end soon. The guy was white as a ghost, and he seemed to finally be giving in to the inevitable. I felt a sense of poetic justice was being served. Actually, almost like nature's justice was being served. I got up and made my way back towards my house. I went straight for the shovel and wheelbarrow, and straight back into the woods. I moved Harley to my favorite part of the property, and buried him. I brought the guy, whose name I never learned, nor cared to an area deeper in the woods past all of my crops. I dug as much as I could, but by the time daylight started to show over the horizon, I barely had made a hole that he could fit in, so I left him in the wheelbarrow and covered him with a tarp. I made my way back to my house and went into the kitchen and grabbed a shopping bag. Then I made my way into the bathroom, where I placed the gun on the sink and my boots and boxers in the bag. As I showered, I watched the blood swirl around the drain, and the whole night's events flashed before my eyes. I felt nothing. No sadness, no remorse, just nothing. I dried off, got dressed, grabbed my phone, and checked the time. It was almost 7 a.m. now. I grabbed the bag with my boots and boxers and made my way to the fire pit, where I threw in a couple of pallets and the bag containing my boots and boxers and ignited it with gas. I watched it burn for probably 15 minutes or so before my phone rang. It was John, and he was on his way. I sat there staring at the fire for about another 45 minutes or so until John arrived. Upon arriving, he could tell something was wrong, so he asked me about it. Last night was a rough night. I accidentally hit Harley with my truck when moving work stuff late at night. He didn't make it. Wow, I'm really sorry to hear that. Harley was a good dog. Yeah, he was, I replied, knowing just how good of a dog Harley was, all the way to the end. Hey, can I use your pisser before we get to work? You know where it is, I reply. John makes his way inside, and I follow. I get everything ready for our day of work. John comes out of the bathroom with my gun and hands it to me. I wiped the outside off for you, and wiped up the blood I could see in the bathroom. Poor Harley. I stared at him blankly for a moment, almost thinking that he might know what happened, before realizing I was overthinking it. About 3:30 rolls around, and we are done for the day. John heads home, and shortly after I head back into the woods to finish what is needed. I dug until late into the night, probably a hole that was a little overkill, but my life literally depended on hiding this, and threw the guy in, and then filled the hole back in. I was, and am confident that he will never be discovered. This property is mine, and I will never sell it, and even when I die, if someone else does live here, I doubt they'll find him. To this day, I sometimes wonder if I made the right decision, but he brought it on himself, and I'm not in jail, so I think I did. I don't care if you believe this story. In fact, I would prefer you didn't. It just feels good to get this off my chest. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you email it to yourmaker6260@gmail.com. I really hope you all enjoyed this list. I actually went through all of my videos for the past year, and I started with anything under a 1% dislike ratio, and I think I ended up having to get one story off something with a 2%. But I got them off of videos that were really high rated, the highest of the year, so that's pretty much how I judged these. They aren't in any particular order. I just kind of threw them all in there as a compilation. For those of you that have been following me the entire year, is there any story that you think should have been in here that didn't make it in here? I'd love to know, so let me know down in the comments. I really appreciate you all watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.